Thank you all for joining me in this session today. I am grateful to SailPoint and SailPoint developer community for providing me the opportunity to present today. I am Raghunath Anne. I have 12 years of expertise in identity and access management and coupled with extensive experience as full stack developer. In today's session, I'll briefly discuss the importance of centralized property management, followed by a deep dive session for the possible for managing the centralized properties for transforms and extend some tips for managing centralized properties for rules. Lastly, I'll introduce SailPoint Configuration Manager, which is a community-developed PowerShell module designed to assist in maintaining the history of configurations. In Identity Security Cloud, the transforms are designed to convert data from one format to another format to achieve the data transformation. Sometimes we do need some hard-coded values or static values. For instance, when you are calculating an email address, you need a first name and last name, which are dynamic values, but you need a second part of it, which is a static value or a hard-coded value that is at xyg.com or at xyzcompany.com. So when such hard-coded values increases, it becomes increasingly challenged to manage them effectively. Some of the challenges are like flexibility. Whenever a static value changes, the administrators has to update that value in multiple places. That may lead to inefficiencies and errors. And also during the migration phase, when you are migrating from lower environment to upper environment or one environment to another environment, each migration becomes a meticulous task when you do not have a centralized property file, or it requires a careful considerations and execution when you are migrating from one environment to another environment. Lastly, it may bring you the collaboration challenges. When multiple team members are working on a project, each using a static value in various places, that may result in conflict and coordination issues. In next slides, I'll be discussing on two possible ways to have one centralized property file. The first way is using the transform, the lookup transform, and the second way is using the source as a property store. Let's get started with the first approach. In the first approach, you will have a property lookup. Here in the property lookup, you will store all your key value pairs. You store your key and the respective values in your table, and this property lookup transform will be used as a reference transform in any other calling transform. For example, if you have some need and you are writing a transform, instead of hard coding the value in that particular transform, you call the reference transform to read that value from the property lookup. And this will work perfectly all right when you have only one environment. But if you have multiple environments like production, UAT, pre-production, and production, you might need to have multiple property files to make the migration simple. The enhanced version of this is you can create one more property file, one more transformation called get property value by key. You pass the key to this property, this transform, and this will return you a value. How will this work? There are three different transform files. You will have three lookup transforms, one for development, one for sandbox, and one for production. And there is a lookup transform again within this get property value by key. This lookup transform will be used to point the appropriate property file. How does that lookup transform does that? It have an explicit input. That explicit input is a get environment. This get environment is a static transform. We create one static transform per environment, and then in this static transform, we store our environment value. Whether it is a development, this static transform will return the development. If your environment is production, this static transform will return a production. And based on that, the lookup transform will point to the right transform lookup for checking the value. So when you pass a key to this get property value by key transform, this will return you the exact value that needed for your transform. This way, you are not hard coding within your current transform, but you are transferring the hard coded value into a centralized property transform. Let me show you this one with demonstration. So I have the transform called properties development, and this is of type lookup. In this transform, I have a table and table of all the properties, I have some properties for OU calculation, I have some properties for employee attribute calculation, and all some of other attributes or a hard-coded values that I need to be moved into a centralized place. And this property development is a transform where we store all our properties in one centralized place. And now we have the properties development. How do we call this properties development? So for that, we call this as a nested transform from other transform. So we are using a reference transform and calling this properties transform, properties development transform in our properties get value by key transform. In this transform, again, this is a property get value by key. It's a lookup transform. You pass a key and it will go to the appropriate environment and fetch a key from appropriate environment. For that, you have a explicit input, properties get environment. This properties get environment, let me open the properties get environment, and in this transform, it always written in which environment you are in. If you are in development, this properties get environment transform will return you the properties get environment will return you the development environment. Since I am in development, this is returning a development, and then in my properties get value by key transform, this is my transform that is used in other transforms. I pass the key to this transform and this will return a value. And this one, as we just see, this is properties get environment, you receive a development, and then in this table it will point to a development, and this development is pointing to a reference properties, that's a properties development. And whatever the input, implicit input for this transform will become an input for property development transform. And this property development transform value, whatever the property development is returning back to this, will be returning back from this properties get value by key. Now let me show you how I can call this properties get value by key in other transforms. For that, let me show you my identity profile configuration. So I have my identity profile, identities, identity profiles. Let me go to the HR identity profile, mappings. Let me search for. Yep. I have an attribute called ADOU, and for this ADOU, I am calculating this ADOU using a get OU by country transform. In this get OU by country transform, I am invoking the get property value by key transform. And the input for this get OU by country, I am passing an input from HR source, and then the attribute is country. This is the implicit input for this get OU by country. This implicit input will be passed to the get OU by country transform. Let me bring you the get OU by country transform onto my screen, and this is a get OU by country transform. And in this transform, I have the first valid transform. I am using a first valid transform, and I have two values for first value. The first one, getting the property get value by key, and the second one, the default, I am passing the default value to the properties get value by key. In both the places, I am calling the transform properties get value by key and without hard coding anything here. So now, whatever the input, that is country code, the country code is a 2-character alpha code that is becomes a input for get OU by country. It's an implicit input that is coming from identity profile, and that input will become an input for this reference because this is the first reference, and whatever the input we have, that will be passed to properties get value by key. And in the properties get value by key, as we see, it have explicit input properties get environment. It will get a development here, and it will go to the properties development. And in the properties development, it will return the appropriate value from the properties development to the properties get value by key. And from properties get value by key, we get that value to the get OU by country. For instance, if you have the country code, the 2-digit alpha, 2-character alpha 2 country code is India, then this will pass the OU, this OU information. If it is any other thing out of, if it is false under any of this configured country, it will be part of this. Else, this property development lookup table, it will, if there is no value here, it will by default it will return null. In the get OU by country, you have two values here. The one value is this reference, So if you have a country code in your properties configured, then that will pull the value from the properties. Now, if you do not have anything and if you are getting a null, the first valid by default it will switch to the second part of it. In the second part, this will get, by default we are passing a default value, and we know for the default value we have some configuration here, and this will return the default value here for the AD default value. This is in the get value by country, and this will fill the value. So always the first valid have some value. So either here and either here it will get passed, and you will have some value for the get value by country transform written back to the identity security cloud identity profile and the attribute AD value. So let me show you some of the examples that I have. So I'm pulling up, I already have the screen ready for the presentation. So I just checked all the users. I'm getting all the identities from my demo tenant. In the demo tenant, if the country is SG and this transformation has already pulled, and then we have AD value as this one. So this is coming from our centralized configuration property from property development. If it is SG, it's a Singapore. If the country is Singapore, and then this is pulling up the appropriate value information into the AD value attribute in the identity profile. In the same way, if you do not have any country here, it is pulling back. It is pulling the default value. The default value is again configured here in the centralized configuration file. This way, we are not hard coding these values in get value by country. We could have hard coded those values in this transform, but the main agenda of this one is to move all the hard coded values into a centralized place. That way we can manage it easily, and administrators can manage it easily in one place. By this ends the first way of achieving the centralized property management. Let me jump to the second way. Let me jump to the presentation. In the second approach, we using the source as a property store. In the source, one of the source we create, and you can either use a JDBC source, or you can use the delimited file source, or any source that you want. You can use it as a source, and you have a key and value attributes that are mapped to your source account ID and account name. Account ID and account name are by default attributes, and the key is mapped to account ID and the value is mapped to account name in your source. So for this, you have to create one source, and then you have to create one generic rule. In the generic rule, what we do is we use the IDN utility method. We have the get account attribute method. For that, the arguments we have to pass is the application name, and then we have to pass the key, and that will return back you the value from the source or the application source we are pointing to. And for this, we need to create one more transform. In the transform, we have a transform type called rule. The rule transform we use. In the rule transform, we call the generic rule that we created, and that generic rule will take care of reading a property from the source and giving a value to the transform back. The beauty of this approach is it is not only for a transforms. Since it is a source, and if you have access to identity utility class, you can use it in any rules as well. So the centralized property file is not only for a transforms, also for the rules. You just need to use idn.get account attribute, and then in the rules also you can use this approach. Let me demonstrate this one. Here I have my source I have my property source. In the property source, I have imported all the properties, the account ID and account name, which is equals to key, and then account name equal to the value of the property. If I go to the import data and account schema, in account schema, I mapped my key from the property. I am using a delimited source, so my column delimited file column key is mapped to the account ID and value is mapped to account name. As I mentioned, we can also use the JDBC source for this one. And you can have two attributes in the JDBC, and you can map the JDBC, and you can store your properties in a JDBC database as well, or any database. And now I have a source and I have an account, and this property, I can invoke this property by passing a key from the generic cloud rule. Let me pull the generic cloud rule, This is a generic cloud rule. Here I have a name of my source. The name of my source is properties, and this is a naming convention that we have to use at the source name. Normally it is called as application name when in the rules. And the input, this is the input that we pass from the transform. This is ideally, it is a key, the key that is passed from the transform. And then the get property value by key. This method is whatever the output of this method will be sent back to the transform, whichever transform that we are calling from. And this get account attribute, we are passing the source name and the key, and we are expecting the value of that key as an output from this generic cloud rule. Now let me pull back the transform that we have. Property get value by key. Well, this is the transform that we have. This is a type rule transform. This is to call the generic rule from the transform. So I have properties get value by key using rule. In this transform, I am using a type rule, and I am calling this is my rule name. Get property value by key version 1 is my rule name. Now we have a transform ready. How can we use it? So we have to pass some implicit input to this transform, and that implicit input will become an input for this rule, and this rule is expecting input as I shown you here. The string input equal to input, and whatever the input that you pass from the transform will become an input. So ideally it is a key that you pass from the previous transform to the rule, and this get property value by the key, you are passing the input to this, and this will accept the return as a value from the rule. So how do we use it? I have one example. I have one attribute. Let me pull up the identity profile again. In the identity profile, I have an attribute called ADUPN. In the ADUPN, I'm calculating ADUPN based on this transform get UPN by identity security cloud UID. In this transform, let me go to get UPN by ISC UID. In this transform, this is again a concatenation. The UID of identity attribute, and then concatenated with the whatever the attribute that we are reading it from the cloud rule. This is a property get value by key using rule. This is a rule that is pointing to a cloud rule, and that cloud rule will return you the value from the source. So let me open the properties get value by key again. Okay, this one. So get UPN by ISC UID. So you have the UPN suffix. You are passing the key as ADP UPN suffix. So let me show you what is the ADP UPN suffix in the property store. So in the property store, the ADP UPN suffix is this value. At ad.demo.sailpoint.com is a value for this AD UPN suffix. Let me go back to the transform. In this transform, we are invoking the property get value by key by rule, and here you will get the UPN value. So then you have the UID from identity attribute and then UPN value from the properties file, that the centralized property store, and this both will get concatenated, and you will have a UPN build or constructed. This way we are not hard coding the UPN in this transform. We are moving that hard coded value, instead of hard coding that in this get UPN by ISC UID transform, instead of doing that, we are moving that into a centralized place, and then we are invoking that by using the get value by key using a rule. The properties get value by using a rule transform. This way you have all your transformations stored in centralized place, that is a that is a source, and here the source is acting as a centralized property store. This ends the second way of this ends the second approach. This way we can use either of the approach. The one is transformation file, the other one is using a source as a property file. This will help us to maintain all our configurations in one centralized place. The second approach is not only for transforms. As I mentioned, this is also for rules. You can, if you have a lot of cloud rules, and then you can go with the second approach that might help you to have one configuration file for both the transforms and also for your cloud rules. Let's move on to the last part of my session. It is about the SailPoint configuration manager. The SailPoint configuration manager is a community built the PowerShell module. I have developed this PowerShell module to download the configuration from the SailPoint tenant and then organize it in a folder structure. And if needed, we can push these configuration changes into the Git repository. It comes with many of the advantages, where if you want to pull back your history, you can go and see what has changed, when it has changed, and if you want to roll back, you can use the history, and you have to get that history, and then you can roll back for the previous history. And this SailPoint configuration manager uses the spconfig API to pull the configuration, and then you push that into the Git repository. So let me show you how this works. So in this, this is a PowerShell module. So you just need to download the PowerShell module and then write a few lines of code to configure this one. I'll show how to do that. Before that, I'll show the output of the already existing code. So this is the output. It pulled the configuration from my demo tenant, and then it created all these folders. Inside these folders, I have all the list of transforms that I have. So here you can see all the transforms that is part of this. The SailPoint configuration manager is available. It's already available in the collab. You can see it in the community tools. You have the SailPoint configuration manager. You can use, and you have the step-by-step guide to how to configure this one on your environment. So let me quickly walk through these steps. The first one is you have to download the source code. You have the source code is available in GitHub. Currently you have two versions in the release, the 1.0.0 and then 1.0.1. Please use the 1.0.1. And once you download this PowerShell module, you have to place that PowerShell module in one of these folders. If you are using only for yourself, it is not a shared Windows machine, then you have to use you can use it in your personal space, or if you want to apply it for all the users, then you can go with placing your PowerShell module in this place. Then you have to import this PowerShell module into your PowerShell session using the command-let import module SailPoint configuration manager. And then you have to do a connection configuration to connect to your tenant. So that will connect to your tenant, and then that will be helpful for pulling the configurations from the tenant. And then you have to execute this magic command, export spconfig. This command-let will pull all the configurations from your tenant and then place in the folder path that you given. And you have to do one-time version control setup. This is a Git control setup. I'm skipping this on this session for a time being. You can go through these steps on the documentation on the developer community. You have all the list of steps to install the Git and then configure. This is a one-time setup. Once you have this one, you don't need to do it on the subsequent when you are executing this code. So I'm directly going to the code snippet. In this code snippet, if you see, we are importing the SailPoint configuration manager into PowerShell module and then configuring it, and then we know on which path the data has to be exported. This is a folder path, and then it comes the Git management. You have invoke git pull command-let to pull the existing configuration to make sure we do not override any other configurations. If you are scheduling this in multiple environments, then it would be good to use always git pull before you use the git push. So that is the reason use invoke-git pull before you do the export spconfig. And this export spconfig command-let will get the latest changes. And invoke add command-let is used to, if there are any new configuration objects, if you have a new transform, new rules, or any new objects in your tenant, then this invoke git add will be helpful to add them into a Git repository. And invoke git commit is to commit if you have any existing files have some changes, and this git commit will helpful to push commit the changes for existing changes. And then invoke push is a final command that will push all these changes into the Git repository. So let me open my Git repository where I have all these things committed. So this is my Git repository. It is called advanced tenant. I have the same list of folder structure, the one that I was showing. This is the folder structure that this scriptlet was exporting to my local machine, and this is being committed or pushed to the JIT. Now let me go back to the JIT again, and let me open the transform something, and you can see all the history of my changes in the JIT repository. I have the history option here, and I can see when and what was changed. This will be very helpful for tracking if you want to track some changes. So if you see, I was changed something. Earlier I was using properties get value by key using rule. I was using a ex email suffix, and then I am using ad upn suffix. I replaced this with this. So for tracking such changes, all the history of your configurations or all the history of changes, it will be very handy feature. You can use this script and schedule it as per your business needs. If you schedule it for every 30 minutes or every 1 day or every week, this will pull, and then you will have all the configuration changes that has made on your tenant available on your JIT repository. By this, it will end my session. This is if you have any questions on the SailPoint configuration manager or the centralized property manager, I'll be available on non-business hours on the SailPoint developer community for if you have any questions on the SailPoint configuration manager PowerShell module. And also I'll ensure I'll upload all the centralized property management project into the developer community as soon as possible. So you will be having all the sample code that I explained today will be available on the SailPoint configuration manager, and it will be available in the Colab. And thank you all.